There was just one thing I wanted to allude to in the history. The English history is you can find in the booklet, and it's largely what I had said. But there's a strong Cleveland connection to this parish, and there was a Hungarian newspaper published here in Cleveland by Tihamér Kohányi, and it was thanks to him really that the building fund of this church began with a $25 donation actually. And the church had closed in 2002. Their last Mass was held on July 7th. And in that time, the church was in a state of limbo. It wasn't purchased until 2007 by an Italian billionaire, a real estate agent, Fiorelli. And his intention, and he had actually purchased many abandoned Catholic churches throughout the United States. His intention was to repurpose these as either a school or an old age home, or for some other use. Unfortunately, it was all fraud, and he was convicted and deported to Italy, and the church suffered for that. So it was in a very bad condition. The roof already had holes in it. And then in 2011, there was a gentleman, Jim Miller, who wanted to purchase the property for a professional wrestling school. And he only intended to use the church's school building and had no intention of using the church, and actually had tried to accomplish its demolition prior to purchasing the property, but that never happened. And it was just by chance that I actually came to find out about this. A few years ago, I digitized the oldest Hungarian Catholic newspaper in the United States, which was called Magyarországi Szent Erzsébet Amerikai Hírnöke, which was published by the pastor of this church, the founding pastor of this church, Father Charles Böhm. And because I'm a teacher, I had gone into remote teaching mode in the spring, and this project just happened to come to my mind that this is something I should complete. So in that time I had completed it, and I knew there were more copies because that publication was published until 1906. And so I came to the archives here at St. Elizabeth, and unfortunately didn't find the remaining copies, but in the process found one copy of the second oldest Hungarian Catholic paper, which was called Magyarok Csillaga. And this was the one that was published by Father Kovács, who was the founder of the Nikisport Church. And so I was in search of this periodical. I thought it also should be digitized. And couldn't find any archives or libraries in the United States that had it. And then I happened to find an article from 1940 in a journal called Western Pennsylvania History that happened to mention that the Daughters of the Divine Redeemer in Elizabeth, Pennsylvania, had copies of this periodical. So I called their archivist, who's Sister Monica Kostolnik. Some of you might know her. She grew up at St. Emerich's Church, and she attended school there. And I asked her if she could find these copies. She didn't find those, but she did find a successor periodical to Magyarok Csillaga, which was also produced by Father Kovács. It was actually a newspaper called Magyar Zászló. And I'd asked her if I could digitize them. And she said, sure, but come in the fall. And so the summer came around, and as a teacher, I have the summers off, and I said, well, I have more time in the summer, so I decided to call her. And thankfully, she agreed, so we met in July, I think July 3rd, to pick up these periodicals. And as I was going down there, the thought occurred to me, well, I should see this church. I knew it was still standing in a bad condition, but just so that I'd have some sort of connection to the editor of this paper I was going to digitize, Father Kovács. And I almost talked myself out of it because it's not the best neighborhood, or people told me it's not the best neighborhood. So, but I decided anyway, oh, let me just go just for a few minutes. So I saw the cornerstone was still intact, and one of my hobbies is actually to photograph cornerstone. So whenever I see one, I take a picture of it, and so it stuck out in my mind. And when I came home, I happened to find in an online newspaper, the Tube City Almanac, an article stating that the city had finally granted owner of the property a contract to demolish the church. So I didn't know how much time was left. And I had tried to contact the city, who never called me back. I had tried contacting the owner of the property, who also never got back to me. I did have luck in the McKeesport Preservation Society in terms of just getting some advice. I contacted the demolition company, and my conversation was very promising with them, but they said they weren't going to remove it beforehand. So it was all up to fate whether this stone would actually survive demolition. I think they forgot about me or didn't take me seriously, and I came to find out on Facebook that the demolition had begun. And I had contacted the owner then on Facebook, and thankfully he responded, but indicated they weren't going to do anything to try to preserve it beforehand. If it survives, it survives, was his attitude. And in the process, I had been interviewed by that same online newspaper, the Tube City Almanac. And unfortunately, they also interviewed the owner of the property, who then started a turf war over this. And I told him, I don't care if we don't get it. I think it's better for it to be honored at a church in a prayerful ceremony. But my ultimate concern is that it's preserved. But still, he didn't want to do anything to preserve it. So finally, when the demolition was completed, apparently it had survived, and he tried removing it, as well as some steel crosses that were above the church. And those were significant because that town had aluminum production factory, so that was a sort of connection to the industry in that area. So he started taking those onto his property, and the police were called out on him, apparently because he didn't retain salvage rights, which is why we have this stone here today. And this wouldn't have happened without the help of Jolt Molnar, honestly. Jolt, through all of his connections and through his perseverance, there were many times where I wanted to give up and didn't have much hope that it would survive, but he pulled through at the last minute with some contacts, and it's because of him, really, that the stone is here today. So we have to thank Jolt also for this effort. And I'm very glad that it's here to be honored. I mentioned in Hungarian that the pastor of this parish, the founding pastor, was Father Coleman Kovács. And he, together with Father Charles Bim, can be hailed as the pillars of Hungarian Catholicism in the United States, because both of them performed great missionary work and had been instrumental in founding several Hungarian Catholic churches in the country. So I'm very happy that we can honor the memory of Father Kovács and the faithful who worked in the coal mines and in the industry there, and sacrificed everything in order to build a church where they could worship God with their Hungarian brothers and sisters. So thank you.